The end of February 1943 found our battalion on the march. Spring vigorously attacked the harsh winter. Fighting night frosts, winter was quickly retreating. Snow became loose, dirty and, as Company Foreman Kamara said, melted at the root. White fields were coloured with brown and greenish spots. It was not easy to walk on the roads in the spring thaw. Soldiers of our company moved on Kharkov by forced march. On one of the crossings, the company column was met by Senior Lieutenant F.Y. Efremenko. Jumping off his horse in a road puddle, he immediately said, "What are you?" "A cavalry unit forming. I counted 16 horses and mules in the company. So the soldiers need a ride. We walk up to 50 kilometers a day on such a road. People fall off their feet. I've seen your men sitting on trophy wagons. Combat ordered us to hurry up. The situation is escalating." At that time we heard a rapidly approaching rumble, and through the holes in the clouds there were fast messes. There came several voices at once. Everyone rushed away from the road and fell on the ground, which was scattered with moisture. The explosions of a series of small bombs rang out, and then, from a second run, several long bursts of machine gun fire were fired at the company column. The planes disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. When we got up, brushed the mud off our overcoats, and looked around, we saw horses and mules tearing in different directions, and a lot of white sheets along the road. Junior Lieutenant Bykov reported about the wounding of 2 Red Army men of his platoon, and Maria Volodina ran to them, unbuttoning her medical bag on the way. "That's 3 good Mulevilis," lamented Pyotr Kamara. Senior Lieutenant Efremenko and I picked up one soiled and soaked sheet. It was an enemy leaflet. It announced a major offensive of the Nazi troops, and, as usual in such cases, offered to surrender as prisoners. The combat situation was changing rapidly. As early as February 16th, parts of the 3rd Panzer Army and the 69th Army started fighting in the streets of Kharkov. The SS Tank Corps, which was part of the Army Group Lance, under the threat of encirclement, surrendered the city. But on February 17th, Hitler, who arrived at his headquarters near Zaporozhye, ordered to wash away the shameful stain of Stalingrad from the uniform of the German army with a powerful counteroffensive in the Kharkov direction. To hit the Red Army was concentrated a large group of troops from 23 compounds with an armoured fist, which included 7 tank and mechanized divisions. German and Italian planes intensively bombed the approaches to Kharkov, the city itself, and simultaneously dropped leaflets. They talked about the upcoming offensive and advertised the latest technology, powerful armoured fortresses on tracks, which allegedly are not afraid of anti-tank shells or engineering mines. The recently liberated Kharkov was again threatened. In the morning of March 2nd, 1943, our company entered Kharkov. The city looked gloomy. On the streets, gaping wounds of war. And yet, when the sun came out from behind the clouds, the city seemed to smile at us with illuminated facades of houses and bunnies of surviving windows. The company was going to the northern outskirts of Kharkov to Sokolniki. There were quite a lot of people on Samskaya, the main street of the city. Some were hurrying somewhere. Others stopped, cheerfully greeting our miners. Others approached the commanders and tried to ask questions. It had been about 2 weeks since the Red Army liberated Kharkov, but people were anxious. Mysyakov gathered the company commanders in the battalion headquarters, located in the mezzanine of one of the houses on Samskaya. "I just came from the commander. Colonel Krasnov appointed head of the engineering forces of the Kharkov defense area. That's right. South of the city, the enemy has already launched a counteroffensive. Having ordered Zigulov to give us the plans of the city, the commander looked out the window. Have you oriented yourself? Here it is, Samskaya. See how many people are walking. They're out in the sun, and people don't know that Hitler gave the order to beat Kharkov back at any cost. Our front 42nd Separate Engineering Brigade of Special Purpose was ordered to urgently prepare the city in engineering terms for defence. To consolidate the captured borders, Kharkov was to be mined again. And 3 battalions of the brigade, having made a heavy, almost 400-kilometre march, arrived from different places in Kharkov. The 208th BIS, commanded by Capt. A. Ivchar, was assigned to mine the western approaches to the city. The 207th BIS, commanded by Capt. M. Babashin, and our 210th BIS of Senior Lieutenant F.V. Mysyakov were ordered to equip sectors with a circular defense in the city. According to the plan of engineering training, Kharkov was divided into 2 battalion zones with 3 company sectors in each. The 207th BIS equipped the southern defense zone with sectors 1, 2 and 3. Our 210th BIS prepared the northern zone of defense with sectors 4, 5 and 6. The 2nd Company took over the 5th defense sector, and I, as company commander, performed the duties and sector engineer. Each sector was divided into 2 or 3 combat areas, also prepared for a circular defense. When we were still on the march, in the streets of Kharkov was announced on the radio about the gathering of members of the city council. Some people smiled skeptically. They said that after the occupation it was unlikely to gather anyone. And what do you think? Almost 40% of the pre-war members of the Kharkiv City Council came. They actively help us, the brigade commander told the next day. Thousands of Kharkiv citizens will go out for defense works, and thousands of tons of various materials will be supplied for the construction of barricades. Defensive work in Kharkov began immediately on March 2nd. The city was quickly girded with anti-tank barricades, ditches, escarpments. Up to 18,000 people went out daily to work on engineering measures. Kharkiv citizens looked exhausted and pale, but determined to do everything in their power to defend the city. Entire families came to help us. In my notebook of those times there are half-erased pencil notes to submit to the district council the families of Korshenko, Malyuga, for encouragement for their selflessness in erecting the barricades. I remember one of those families from those times. A man in his 60s, his young and pretty wife, and a blonde son of 13 or 14 years old were carefully carrying a heavy metal hedgehog beam past me. "You'll strain yourself," I said to the man. "Be careful." "Maybe I will," the head of the family replied angrily. "But it's for your own." Kharkov specialists engineers offered their services to improve the designs of the barricades, to increase their strength and resistance to tank ramming. The work of the townspeople was led by instructors soldiers of the company, allocated 1 for 20 to 30 people. Our company's liaison with the district council Komsomol girl Zoya tirelessly travelled around the sites, escorting more and more people there. There was not enough tools. We did not have time to set new groups of tasks. And people did not leave the sites for 10 to 12 hours, immediately ate the modest food brought with them, and started working again. First of all, measures were taken to set up barricades, to prepare for the explosion of bridges, and to set up minefields. The arrangement of barricades provided for the creation of a unified network of barricades with cut-off positions and SAX traps for enemy tanks. Barricades were erected from scrap metal, cars, poles, furniture, filled with stone, covered with earth and entangled with barbed wire. All this was attached to deeply buried rails. Mines, hedgehogs and metal beams were prepared to close the passages left behind. At Shatilovka and Pavlovka, where there were precipitous hillsides, anti-tank escarpments were equipped. From March 3rd to March 8th, several hundred barricades with a length of 40 kilometers were built in the streets of the city. More than 12 kilometers of anti-tank ditches and escarpments were dug on the outskirts. Hundreds of loopholes in stone buildings were equipped. Bridges on the rivers Lopan, Kharkov and Udi were being prepared for explosion. And on the main tank, dangerous directions minefields were installed. Most of the northern part of the defense zone between the rivers Lopan and Kharkov was occupied by the 5th sector. There were 2 main tank hazardous directions, Belgorod at Samskaya Street and Dergichev at Shatilovka. The main attention of the company was concentrated on the defense of Samskaya, the main street of the city, which rested in the north in the forest park area Sokolniki, covered with oak, pine and low shrubbery. This park was a favourite place of rest of citizens in peacetime. The asphalted Belgorod highway connecting with Samskaya Street ran here. Between the green zone and modern stone houses on the outskirts of the city lay a flat meadow 300 to 500 meters wide, and in some places up to 1,000 meters. All the alleys and streets facing this clearing were blocked by barricades or simply rubble, and in the clearing near Sokolniki, to the left and right of the Belgorod highway, we prepared minefields. Mines, explosives and means of detonation used trophy mines. Not far from our planned areas of mining were concentrated warehouses of the enemy. They were located in the courtyards of several buildings of Samskaya. TMI-42 mines were neatly stacked. Fuses with mine detonators were located at a distance in specially equipped buried log cellars. We must admit that the German sappers organized the storage according to all the rules of mine engineering. There was, of course, a danger that these warehouses were prepared by the enemy for explosion, but a thorough check allowed to reject such a version. The enemy was obviously preparing to mine the city, but did not have time to realize his plans. We had only to take advantage of the work of the Nazi army sappers. "That's good for the Krauts," quipped Volodya Nazarov. "At least once favored us. And these stocks of mines will be enough, right?" On the first day of the work at Sokolniki, we were accompanied by the commander of the brigade, Vitaly Petrovich Krasnov. Not young, very mobile, despite his fullness, the colonel easily walked to the platoon, preparing mines for installation. "Hello, Masyakovtsi," cheerfully greeted the commander, having heard the report. "Are you fully manned, Lieutenant? 108 men in a company, that's a lot of strength. It's almost a battalion." "Yes, what an addition." "The Kharkovians are good." 1-1. Kombrig went around the area designated for mining, and then, checking the map with the terrain, turned to Masyakov, Nazarov and me. "The main thing, anti-tank mines. Take into account, there is data that in the group of armies of Manstein really arrived super-heavy tanks. They can be effective in street battles. Prepare to welcome the guests. Make it fun." We were attentive to every gesture and word of the commander. "Here, brothers sappers, we can build an excellent mine trap. The fronts of the minefields should be turned around. Join the barricades." Krasnov continued. Kombrig proposed a rather clever and intricate system of barricades from separate groups of mines, landmines, minefields and barricades, deeply echeloned along the highway and Samskaya Street. It was also proposed to arrange rubble by blowing up the stone walls of several houses. Take note, brothers sappers, the task is difficult, but necessary. In parallel with mining, you and your assistants, Kharkiv citizens, to lead you and erect barricades. Colonel Krasnov hurried to the attached battalions, already mined the southern approaches to the city. "It's time to go. It is necessary to be in time to the 13th Battalion of the Guards miners Karpov and Kozura's Injbat. German tanks are trying to break through to Kharkov from the south. The fascists dream of creating something like German Stalingrad." Kombrig gave the necessary orders to Masyakov, then turned to me. "Well, Lieutenant, your company 5th Sector to defend. You will defend the city from the north to lure armoured spiders into the mine web." When Colonel VP Krasnov said goodbye to us, he sadly said, Kharkov. "It is not the first time I have to mine you, my dear." Less than a year and a half before the described events, Kharkov was already mined by our troops. The work at that time was led by the famous miner Colonel I.G. Starinov. Even then, along with the usual pressure mines and time mines with clockwork mechanism, the latest mines controlled at a distance by radio were used here. On October 25, 1941, Hitlerites for the first time took Kharkov. The head of the city garrison, General Georg von Braun, waited a whole week while the Deutsche pioneer and demined and detonated the detected mines, suffering heavy losses. But when the enemy troops settled in a number of buildings, including the house on Dzerjinsky Street, 17, hidden mines were detonated by radio signals sent 300 kilometers away from Voronezh. In all, 11 radio-controlled devices with large explosive charges managed to detonate in Kharkov. Among the buildings blown up by radio by Soviet miners was a house that housed the headquarters of the 68th German Infantry Division. The explosions made a stunning impression on the Hitlerites. Mine danger alarmed the enemy. It is curious that the underground reinforced concrete two-storied shelter left intact in the city, not far from the building of Gazprom, Hitlerites never used neither in 1941 nor in 1943, after our troops left Kharkov for the second time. The Germans were afraid that as soon as they occupied the shelter, it would be blown up with them. And so Kharkov was once again stuffed with explosives, but it was no longer 1941, but 1943. The general situation was quite different. It made no sense to put radio-controlled fuses and time mines. The city was not going to surrender to the enemy. Heavy defensive battles began on the outskirts of the city. Having occupied Pavlograd and Lozovaya, the enemy rushed to Kharkov from the south. And on March 4th, by forces of the 4th Tank Army, Hitlerites undertook an attack on Kharkov from the west and north. While we were engaged in defensive works in the city, companies of the 208th Separate Battalion of Engineering Barriers under the command of Captain I. Avchar mined the roads leading to Kharkov in the areas of Ulipan, Lyubotin, Pesochin and Myrifa. The units with which the units of Avchar's battalion operated were subjected to tank attacks of the enemy. The 1st and 3rd companies under enemy fire set minefields and destroyed bridges in the Pesochin area, covering the withdrawal of units of the 303rd Infantry Division, which was badly damaged in the battles. Later I was told about the fate of the squad commander Sergeant Ivliev. After installing a minefield on the outskirts of Pesochin, his squad had to close the passage in the mines left for the passage of rifle units that were still fighting ahead. Toward evening, amidst the anxious noise of battle, the steady murmur of a tank diesel engine was heard. A tank appeared from the bushes. Its silhouette was clearly visible against the evening sky. The identity of the tank was not in doubt. The sergeant only had time to shout close as the tank machine gun mowed down one of the miners. Then Ivlev, grabbing 2 mines already equipped with fuses, crawled to the passage. There was an explosion. The tank turned around and stopped. Its track was broken. But at the same moment the sergeant's life was cut short. The fiercest fighting was in the 62nd Guards Rifle Division in the area of Myrifa, where the 2nd Company of the 208th BIZ, commanded by Senior Lieutenant N. Rozhkov, was mined. 4 or 5 attacking tanks exploded on the mines. Artillerymen shot the blown-up enemy vehicles. The enemy began to bypass Myrifa from 2 sides, and on the right heavy tanks managed to cut into the fighting order of rifle units. In Rozhkov's company at this time was a doctor of the 208th BIZ Senior Lieutenant of Medical Service NEA, Anikichik. Not far from the place where the mines were laid, in a cabin on the outskirts of the village, she bandaged 2 men of the company, preparing them to be sent to a field hospital. Another severely wounded mineral was brought in. Accompanying fighters sparingly told, "Passages in minefields have already closed, and the Krolts from the tank knocked." That's what happened. About an hour after Nadezhda Efimovna sent the wounded on a cart, the son instructor of the 2nd Company I, Kulikov, ran into the house. "Comrade Senior Lieutenant, tanks." "What are you talking about?" "German tanks." The lady of the house, trembling with fear, crossed the threshold of the room with difficulty. "Tikate, doctor, on the hill." From the attic was perfectly visible, as meters in 40 meters stopped grey-green tank with white crosses. Several Hitler's machine gunners from the troop sitting on the tank fearfully examined the neighbouring houses. The tank's turret synchronously turned behind them. They looked into the house, where in the attic, holding their breath, sat a military doctor and a medical officer. Almost alive, the mistress herself opened the doors of the house to the German soldiers, bowing low, waved her hands, they said. There was no one. The engine roared, and the tank with machine gunners moved on. With the onset of darkness, Nadezhda Efimovna and Kulikov came down from the attic and went in the direction of Kharkov. They walked for 3 nights and hid during the day. On the 4th day they reached the city and joined our battalion. In the battles on the outskirts of Kharkov, the companies of the 208th BIZ suffered a lot, but the mine barriers they had set up caused the enemy serious losses and contributed to the disruption of the pace of the counter-offensive. Rozhkov's company, having closed the passages in the minefields, blew up the previously prepared bridges over the rivers Myazhar and Myrifa, and then went out with battles to Rogan. 2 other companies led by Combat Avchar together with rifle units also came out of the encirclement. A few days passed, and 2 battalions of our brigade, remaining in Kharkov, also had to drink to the bottom of the bitter cup. SS Panzer Corps continued to punch a hole in the semicircle of Soviet troops, stubbornly defending on the outskirts of Kharkov. But only since March 8th both citizens and we ourselves felt the fiery breath of battle. From March 8th to March 10th, Italian and German planes continuously bombed the city. Never, neither before nor after that, we had never seen such a number of Italian wide-winged belly-belly airplanes. It was Mussolini's revenge for the Italian army defeated west of the Don. The defensive works were paralyzed. Brutal bombing raids dispersed thousands of people. Only the soldiers of the 207th and 210th BIS continued their hard work. Some of the barricades were destroyed, dozens of houses were smashed, and hundreds were burning. Fire and rescue teams did not have time to provide help. Too many people needed it. From Engineer Captain Kuzmin, who was part of Colonel Krasnov's task force, we learned that we should be ready to meet German tanks. And indeed, by the evening of March 10th, 1943, they broke through from the north along the Dergachev and Belgorod highway to the outskirts of the city. Bombing, which was particularly intense that day, suddenly stopped, and almost immediately street battles began. German machine gunners began to infiltrate into Kharkov, bypassing it from the side of Bolshaya Danilovka. In the meantime, the enemies lurking in the city became sharply active. Ukrainian nationalists opened fire from attics and from windows at servicemen and citizens who were conducting defense work. Later we learned that there were several small but dangerous groups of UNAVists operating in Kharkov. It was they who were shooting at our backs. Units of the 3rd Tank Army, introduced into the city after heavy fighting, had only 18 to 20 tanks in brigades. These fighting machines were tirelessly maneuvering through the defense sectors, repulsing the enemy's continuous attempts to break through to the center of the city. The 5th Sector of Defense, engineering preparation of which was performed by our company, was attacked by the enemy in the first place. Here were 20 militiamen, a company of the NKVD, several tanks, and our engineering and mine company. There were no other troops in this sector, and the available forces, which I listed, scattered in numerous streets and alleys. Volodya Nazarov, with a contact man, hurried to Shatilovka. It was necessary to have time by forces of platoon of Lieutenant M.E. Danilov to close the passages in minefields, blocking the Dergachev direction. And I stayed with the platoons of Junior Lieutenant V. I. Bykov and Senior Sergeant I. Bykov and Staff Sergeant M.S. Danilov at Sokolniki, where Samskaya Street came out to the Belgorod highway. This was considered the main direction of the northern defense zone. It was deceptive March weather. Before evening at 6 or 7 o'clock, the chill of early spring had already replaced the timid warmth of the day. We were shivering from dampness, expecting the appearance of Hitlerites at Sokolniki. As if not wishing to test our patience, ahead on the Belgorod highway, we heard the approaching clanking of tracks. The head German tank began firing from short stops. Along Samskaya flew armor-piercing shells. Can we close the passages in the minefields near Samskaya? Are there no our units ahead which we should still have time to pass? Should I wait for a command or act according to the situation myself? These were the questions I was puzzling over at that moment. Events were developing rapidly. In 1 or 2 minutes we began to clearly distinguish unusually long barrels of tank guns with muzzle brakes and crosses on the sides of the first seen Tigers. It was impossible to delay. Close the passages. Suddenly I heard my own excited shout. The liaisons rushed to the squads in front and on the flanks. On the highway near Sokolniki and at the beginning of Samskaya, sappers prepared holes in the asphalt and inserted in advance in them the bodies of mines without fuses. The mines were echeloned on the highway by depth and were adjacent to the minefields set up in Sokolniki, or directly to the stone buildings on the streets. It was impossible to bypass them without demining them. For camouflage purposes we broke the asphalt in many places, and therefore from afar the mines remained almost invisible. In addition, we prepared bundles on ropes from captured TMA-42s. The miners, who lurked in the entrances of the houses nearest to the road, could at the right moment drag these bundles of mines by ropes right under the tracks of enemy tanks. Now it was urgent to put the main mines laid on the road in combat readiness. The men of the company crawled to them. But enemy shells were already whistling over the mines. Was it too late? I gave the command to close the passage. As a commander, I had to endure then a serious test. On the one hand, I knew very well that the lives of my subordinates depended on the timeliness of the command. But on the other hand, the situation was such that any other decision could also turn out to be not the best. Combat, as a rule, is a complex task with many unknowns. What if our troops had appeared first and fought ahead? What if from the depths of the city our tanks came up to support the forward units? A lot of different ifs were in front of me then. The miners had already approached the groups of mines. I could clearly see how Sereda, the oldest of the namesakes, together with Novikov, Vysotsky and Kolodyazhny, pressing against the asphalt, unscrewed the flat covers of TMI-42. Here they carefully inserted fuses, screwed the covers, and with their palms thrust pieces of broken asphalt over them. From time to time the miners looked back at the moving tanks. Will they have time or not? To equip a TMI mine, an experienced specialist needs only a few seconds. But how these seconds are stretched when, rattling 60-ton armoured body, the enemy is moving on you. German tankers obviously noticed the miners. The front tanks stopped. Instead of another armour-piercing bolt, they hit with shrapnel. We didn't have time for a bit," shouted Junior Lieutenant Bykov and rushed to the nearest group of mines. A few jerky, nervous movements, and he, covering the body of the killed Sereda Sr., did what his dead subordinate had not had time to do. When Bykov was dragging the body of Red Army soldier Sereda off the sidewalk, the enemy tankers struck again with shrapnel. The junior lieutenant was wounded in the back and in the throat. We, with fighters and Volodina, carried him to the entrance of the house on Samskaya. Bykov had a red spring of blood running from his mouth. Young, freckled face, framed by golden hair, expressed a desperate struggle with pain. Bykov was silent, clenched his teeth tightly. Masha quickly bandaged him, tearing one by one the individual packets. Tigers stopped. Apparently they did not risk going into the minefields, but continued to fire along the street. Anxiously passed a sleepless night. And before morning 5:30 Shevers came up to us, and the German tanks transferred their blow to another section. The general situation in the city was still unclear, but we felt that the task of the miners in our section was accomplished. Tigers never managed to make a throw to Samskaya Street. Hitler's tanks approached the northwestern outskirts of Kharkov along the Dergachev Highway almost at the very moment when the Tigers appeared in Sokolniki. Germans tried to break through to Klokskovskaya Street. Staff Sergeant Ashabak from the platoon of Lieutenant Danilov immediately established a connection with the commander of the tank company and immediately reported to the arriving Nazarov. "You, Comrade Lieutenant, just in time to arrive. The commander of the platoon at Zhuravlevka. What about the bridge? Should we blow it up? Our men are still ahead of us. Put detonators in the charges, and we'll wait for blowing it up." Over a deep ravine, with a stream, there was a wooden bridge 10 meters long. From the ravine in the direction of Sokolniki, Kharkov citizens equipped escarpment, and in front of the ravine, to the right and left of the bridge, our company set groups of mines. Thanks to this small bridge became the main bottleneck in this area, and its importance was understood by every soldier. Our tankers prudently took the tanks behind the bridge, and the miners made the groups of mines adjacent to the stone buildings ready for action. "We had to sweat with the bridge," Nazarov said when we met at Shatalovka. "We heard engines roaring. I went to the tankers, and they also doubted whether it was theirs. However, everything became clear quite quickly. A Tiger appeared near the bridge. Shabak turned the blasting machine. By night the situation had changed. German tanks transferred the blow and began shelling the streets adjacent to Klokskovskaya. Long before dawn the rumble of tanks was heard to the left of the bridge. Shachabak rushed to the barricade that closed one of the adjacent streets. There was no one here. He ran to the passage in the barricade towards a German tank moving with lighted headlights. The experienced senior sergeant realized that in the absence of troops, only miners alone could block the path of the enemy tankers and prevent them from reaching the rear of our company. The distance between man and tank was rapidly shrinking. Shechebak recalled later that he was thrown into a shiver. Very unequal forces were. Is it necessary to start a fight for passage? Frantically thought he. Wouldn't it be better to go straight away by the reconnaissance yards to their own on Samskaya and there to report about the tanks? Think quickly, Andrei, he ordered himself. Otherwise it will be too late. Caterpillar will crush, and instead of Shebak, wet place will remain. At that moment the senior sergeant saw the second tank appear from around the corner, rumbling. At the same time he heard stomping and shouting. He looked back. His own Red Army men F.A. Puzanov and V.I. Yerats. Hurry up, boys. Push the mines. Pull the hedgehogs. Tuck. More. Shachebak shouted after a few seconds, having overcome the shocked state. The enemy tankers became uneasy, although they were behind the armour. Hitlerites did not know that there were only 3 Soviet soldiers in front of them. Tanks stopped, rumbling heavily and winking with searchlights. And then the tank guns started talking. At you, whistled the shells fired at the barricade. Having closed the passage with hedgehogs and mines, the miners hid in the nearest entrance. It was hard for them to recover after a frantic 2-minute physical and moral tension. After a little breathing, they opened machine gun fire at the tanks through the barricade. Having shot a little, we decided that it was time to withdraw through the courtyards. What was Shebak's surprise when he heard the engines of the tanks roaring and the sound of them began to go away. The Nazis did not want to take any chances. Gave the back, the tanks disappeared around the corner. Wow! Shebak could only say, looking at Puzanov and Yerats. He still did not believe that the single combat with the tanks was won. Before dawn on March 11th, Nazarov arrived at Samskaya. Well, valiant second. Are you still fighting? And I thought that maybe you had withered without us. By the way, friends, war is war, but we should have a snack, right? Volodya Nazarov dragged me to the basement of the house where the company's CP was. Well, give me a guitar, he said, and quietly sang. You can't see the city crowd. The shells are flying along Samskaya. And indeed, Volodya had no sooner finished the verse when shots were heard again nearby. We jumped out of the cellar. NKVD fighters ran past with carbines. One of them shouted to us like old acquaintances. Hold on, Sapiriki. In case of anything, call us. The artillery duel between the 30 Cheverkas and Tigers resumed. Again whistled shells. In the morning, at last communication was established with the battalion headquarters, which had already left Samskaya. The liaison brought a packet with the order of Mysyakov about the company's withdrawal across the Kharkov bridge to Rogan. But it was not easy to gather the company. After all, the peculiarity of mine and sapper companies is the use of fighters in separate independent small groups, from 2 men to a squad. To maintain contact with them in a combat situation in a city with dozens of streets and alleys is very difficult. If each squad had its own portable radio. But that was only a dream back then. We found 15 men from the company killed and wounded. But besides them, the company was missing about 30 more men. It was impossible to continue the search. Leaving the miners to close the passages, we moved to the square of industry. On a huge deserted, paved with stone space, gloomily blackened hulk of the house of the State Prom. The company column with wagons and kitchen had already crossed the square when a car blocked our way. Who is in charge? Where is the commander? Asked, getting out of the truck, a short, broad-shouldered colonel with a strong-willed face. I'm listening to you, comrade colonel. Not a step further. Go back to your places. But the order of the unit commander. Execute my order. I'm an authorized representative of the Military Council of the Front. I've been instructed to restore the situation in the city. The company turned around and headed back to Sokolniki and Shatilovka. Soon I was summoned to the headquarters of the tank brigade. In the basement of the house on Samskaya I saw the general, so things are not so bad. It was the head of the garrison of Kharkov, Major General of Tank Troops E. Belov. Your company should provide a counterattack of the tank battalion in the direction of Sokolniki. Do you understand? Nothing was clear to me, but for some reason I mumbled that everything is clear, and rushed to his room. Everything fell into place quite quickly. To the minefields came up 8 or 9:34, and the major tankist immediately explained what was required of us. We removed the mines from the passages. Behind each tank, covered by armour, ran miners. Our and German tankers engaged in a firing duel. Several German tanks and 30 Chevers burst into flames. Then ours, shooting back, slowly withdrew to the original. We also returned, missing 4 comrades, but Hitlerites did not renew more attempts to get to Samskaya by frontal attack. Street fighting continued for the 3rd day. The company units, dispersed in numerous streets and alleys, carried out combat tasks not only to close the passages and the barriers and to blow up bridges, but also to cover them with fire. They acted according to the situation, establishing, where possible, communication with our few units. It was alarming all around. From the adjacent streets we could hear machine gun bursts. The enemy bypassed Samskaya from the flanks and continued to infiltrate into the city. We lost contact with the commander of the 2nd Platoon, Lieutenant Danilov. Groups of our miners, without noticing anything, found themselves on the streets, which the enemy bypassed. So it happened with Junior Sergeant I, P. Frolov, and Red Army Man P.A. Samoylenko, who after the explosion of the bridge over the River Lopan moved back to put in combat readiness pre-installed mines on one of the nearby streets. But they never had time to do so. The street was deserted. To the left and right was heard shooting, and from somewhere behind, through the labyrinth of street passages, came the muffled noise of battle. Suddenly commands in German were heard. The first to pull himself together was the junior sergeant. Having discharged from behind the wall the disc of a trophy automatic rifle in Hitlerites, who appeared not far away, he grabbed Samoylenko by the sleeve and dived with him into the entrance. Now the Krolts will come to comb through. Yesterday in this house the mistress fed us. The only salvation is to go to her. Klavdia Alexandrovna Domskaya, who lived with her 16-year-old son, opened the door at once. Looking at the faces of the miners, the woman understood everything. Hurry to the cellar. There you'll stay there until night. By evening, creaking with her prosthesis, Klavdia Alexandrovna came down to the cellar. You can't go out. In the courtyard the Hitlers put their soldiers' kitchen. They're still running around. Here's some food for you. And these are my husband's civilian suits, just in case. He's also fighting somewhere, if he's alive. Domskaya said that German armoured personnel carriers and vehicles had passed along the street, that our units were not visible, but the shooting continued in the city. The enemy's cars are scurrying around, and in the sidewalk mines unequipped. Frolov gritted his teeth. The next day again the prosthesis tapped hastily and light appeared in the cellar. Dear, dear, help, sobbing, wailed Domskaya. My son, my only. Help me to avenge the Hitlers. I have no strength. Help me. It turned out that Klavdia Alexandrovna had sent her son to find out how best to get the miners languishing in the cellar out of the city. The son went with a comrade. The boys tried to stay away from the German soldiers. But they never got far. Both of them were captured by the Nazis. Captured near a temporary food warehouse. Accused of trying to steal some products, immediately hanged on a small square near the house where the boys lived. Neighbours told Domskaya about it. It all seemed so monstrous that the mother did not believe the people. She herself went to the place of execution and collapsed at the gallows, shocked by the disaster that fell on her. Mother's grief resulted in an inexorable thirst for revenge. With the onset of darkness, Klavdia Alexandrovna led the miners into the courtyard, already abandoned by the German economic unit. The occupants opened fire on any suspicious passerby. Having waited until the clatter of wrought iron boots subsided, she resolutely led Frolov and Samoylenko through the courtyards to the square where the gallows stood. Miners and mother, huddled together, looked silently at the moonlit 2 skinny corpses. There on the left, that's mine. Did you see that? Domskaya said with a groan. Now let's go. Trying not to bang her prosthesis, she led the miners to the place where the mines were laid. The woman went outside first and signaled that no one was there. The miners quickly identified the location of the mines they had set and removed the camouflage layer of asphalt. The mines turned out to be untouched. Frolov and Samoylenko put the fuses. When the mines were equipped and camouflaged, the junior sergeant and a Red Army soldier approached Domskaya, who stood aside at the wall of the house. She signaled that it was necessary to go into the yard, and she herself, looking around incessantly, was the last to leave the street. Klavdia Alexandrovna led the miners through the courtyards and nooks in the direction of the tractor factory. In some yard they parted. At parting, the mother kissed the miners. Almost simultaneously, an explosion went off in the distance. "Maybe this is our revenge," she whispered. "God forbid you to experience what I experienced." And then, bypassing German patrols, we got out of Kharkov and walked to Volchansk, where Samoylenko had relatives, Ivan Pavlovich Frolov told later. There we found the battalion. But the gallows with the boys and the bloodless face of the unhappy mother still stand before my eyes. Tanks, with which we went to attack at Sokolniki, were ordered to counterattack the enemy in another area. The 230 Sheverks that remained to cover Samskaya continued to conduct an artillery duel with heavy Tigers. Having sent wagons with the wounded and kitchen to Volchansk, we were still waiting for some miracle. But the miracle did not happen. Together with the platoon of tanks, exhausted, shooting away on the move, the miners withdrew. The accumulation of cars and people near the Kharkov bridge, where we arrived, attracted the attention of messers. They dropped a series of small bombs. The wounded Volodya Nazarov cried out and fell down. We pushed the deputy, pale from blood loss, into the back of the stopped ambulance, and it moved, quickly gaining speed. Volodya's face flashed at the back of the car. He shouted something, but it was impossible to make out. Not at once we realized the gravity of the company commissar's loss. His hurried speech sounded in our ears for a long time. His kind smile, blurred on his skinny face, stood before our eyes for a long time. He spoke hastily, as if fearing that he would not have enough time to finish his thought. He held political discussions with some special enthusiasm. We never tired of being surprised by his resourcefulness and memory. Always open to his comrades, illuminated by an unquenchable inner fire, people needed him very much, and they believed his simplicity and sincerity. They say about a man fearless, Nazarov once started a conversation with miners, but it is not quite accurate. The feeling of fear is familiar to everyone, but it manifests itself in different ways. Courage and consists in overcoming fear. You're afraid, and yet you go under fire. It's the right thing to do. It is a duty to the fatherland, to your relatives. Volodya was silent, looked at the soldiers carefully. Let's take you and me. It's long been known a miner makes a mistake once in his life. So what, not to take up the mine? It's a big risk, of course. It's dangerous. But anyway, no one has ever refused to use mines. The men know it's dangerous, but they do the job. It can't be otherwise. The sense of duty is stronger than all other feelings experienced by each of us. Volodya liked philosophical generalizations. Nothing people need so much as justice. He liked to dream. What do you think? If we attack like this, when will we reach Berlin? It is interesting to see what Hitler will do then. Volodya was drawn with all his heart to a blonde-haired girl, volunteer Maria Zubkova, who shortly before coming to Kharkov was taken to us as a company clerk. But the people around us did not even guess about anything. I do not know what it cost the deputy, but he kept with her emphasized officially, so as not to demoralize others. He left all explanations for after the war. Volodya remembered his mother with great warmth. Once before the change of infantry in Novopskov, he wrote her another letter. Handing it to the company foreman, Kamara said, "Send it, Pyotr Kornaik, but not before 15 days. I asked why not at once. So today I've already sent one letter. And this one, let it wait. I wondered what might happen. Let my mother not know about the misfortune for longer." Volodya was silent for a long time, as if thinking whether to speak or not. "All right. I'll tell you," he said at last. "I read a book before the war. I don't remember the title. There was a young man sentenced to death for nothing, and when they asked him his last wish, he asked for more paper and a quill. He wrote for 3 days. The address on all the envelopes was the same, his mother's address. Volodya smiled sadly. And do you know what he wrote about? About how he would live and what he would do in 6 months, a year, 10 years, 15 years. He passed off fantasy as reality. He was promised that the letters would be sent to the addressee according to the dates stamped in them. I don't know if it was right, but I would have done the same. Before going on a mission, Nazarov used to ask, "Which platoon should I go with? Where do you think is more necessary, more dangerous? Take into account, I have to be exactly there. It is stipulated even by the instruction." He really wanted to be where it was more dangerous. But not because of the manual, but because of duty. And today an ambulance was taking the wounded deputy from Kharkov, which was still buzzing with street battles. Arriving at the hospital, Volodya immediately wrote to the company. I have his letter dated March 15th, 1943. WE were bombed and shelled 20 to 30 times in places where cars were piled up. The chauffeur and a nurse were killed on this car. How I stayed alive, I don't know. I was concussed. I can't hear my left ear, but I think it will pass. I can't describe everything that happened. My wound's pretty bad. A broken bone, but the doctors say I'll be back in action. But I'm afraid that it won't fester. In Kupiansk, where I am, all the hospitals are full of wounded. You know why. Wait for me, Sasha, at your place. I hope to work together a lot more. You and I understood each other half-heartedly. Many thanks to Marusa, the paramedic. Hello to Himara Bovin. How are Lucia and Misenka? How are they howling? Have they gotten used to it? You take care of the girls, you know the situation is already difficult. Give my suitcase to Musa Zubkova. I wish you to be alive and well. With communist greetings. Vova. Everyone in the company believed that Nazarov would definitely come back to us after his recovery. We simply did not think that he could be replaced by someone else. A month and a half or 2 months passed. Nazarov sent some tidings from Zlatust Hospital. Then, in a letter dated June 24, 1943, he said that they finally granted his request for early discharge. But they sent him to the deputy commander of the anti-tank battery. Another month passed, and we received a letter from Volodya with the stamps of his new field mail. ... Here I am fighting again. My leg sometimes aches, reminding me of the Kharkov wound. But it's nothing. We had hot days here. Knowledge of our potatoes came in handy. We often use them here too. I'm considered a professor in this field. I think of you all, perhaps, as often as I think of my mother. We are related for life. I soon received a reply to my letter to my new address, but it was written in someone else's hand. It said that Vladimir Nazarov died a brave death while repelling a tank attack of fascists. In the afternoon of March 12th, the streets leading to the southeastern outskirts of the city and near the bridge over the Kharkov River became crowded and restless. Automobiles were rushing. Soldiers and commanders were wandering in groups. Horse carts were dragging. Everyone was in a hurry to cross the bridge. Cavalrymen told how miraculously escaped from the fire in the area of Lubotin. Infantrymen from near Mirifa recalled the single combat with SS tanks. The western, northern and half of the eastern part of the city were already in enemy hands. Near the Kharkov bridge, here and there flashed the crackling of machine guns, obviously. The fascists were trying to capture the bridge unharmed. After the intense battle and sleepless nights, the miners needed rest. We settled down in the room of a former kindergarten in a house not far from the bridge. The soldiers had a hasty lunch and dozed off on the floor. Sizidka Klaiche Poznadati reported a taciturn Rublenko. I saw you from the balcony. Tired, hungry. Well, I think at least I'll feed the commander. A burly woman met me and Rublenko and sat us down at the table. Machine gun bursts struck so close that we jumped up at once. We rushed to raise the personnel of the company. Barely our soldiers had time to cross the 3-span bridge over the Kharkov River as the Hitlerites came close to the house, which we had just left. the 210th has arrived," greeted me behind the bridge commander of the 207th Battalion D. M. Babishin. M. Babishin. Connect quickly to Kharkov. Shells exploded nearby cut short the conversation with Babishin. There was a ringing clang of tracks. Everything spun around. At 17 o'clock on March 12, 1943, several tanks and coffin-like armoured personnel carriers with crosses and SSS signs appeared near the mined Kharkov bridge. The bridge was prepared in advance for explosion by the 2nd Company of the 207th BIS, which was then commanded by military technician of the 1st rank A, Rykov. Here Rykov sharply turned the handle of the blasting machine. We were waiting for an explosion, but there was no explosion. But the work of tank engines was heard more and more clearly. What happened? Did shrapnel break the wires of the explosive electrical system? And the German tanks were approaching. Their fire became stronger and stronger. And suddenly, a tall, thin Red Army soldier rushed towards them and then disappeared under the bridge. Now everything was decided by seconds. The first tank came close to the bridge. At that moment, a powerful explosion shook the air. A black cloud filled with metal debris rose above the ground. In the nearest houses blew out the glass. It was Sergeant A. G. Rices from Rakov's company under heavy fire, right in front of the enemy tanks, reached the duplicate firing network and set fire to the Bickford cord. The daredevil had no time to take cover and was badly concussed by the blast wave. Rices woke up when it was completely dark. By dawn, he managed to get out of Kharkov, again occupied by Nazi troops. A few days later, Rices found his battalion, with which he had travelled the whole combat route to the end. The brave sergeant died already after the war, saving German children who found themselves on a wild minefield at the request of the local burgomaster. Having demined the passage, he took out a boy. But when he tried to disarm the mine to get to another child, he made some mistake. A miner, as we know, makes a mistake only once in a lifetime. It is symbolic that Rices gave his life, saving children whose fathers, perhaps, drove his little brothers from distant Kremelnik into torture houses. It was with pain that we left Kharkov. We could still hear shooting in the city, but it was already subsiding. The enemy spent thousands of shells shelling the barricades, behind which there were no troops. Numerous obstacles hindered the maneuver of Hitler's tanks and hampered the actions of infantry, but especially detained the enemy the explosion by the Soviet miners of the bridges mined in advance. Only the 207th Separate Battalion of Engineering Obstacles completely destroyed 10 bridges over the rivers Lopan and Kharkov, which cut the city into 3 parts. 3 bridges were blown up by our 2nd Company of the 210th BIS. And in Kharkov, we managed to blow up 21 bridges out of 22 prepared for blowing up. German sappers had to demine the tank dangerous directions and passages between the barricades for a long time, and it took days and weeks to equip temporary bridges. On March 13th, the company left Kharkov. The way to the east was cut off. There was only one way out to the southeast. Having walked through the mud at least 10 kilometers, we took a break only at Zmeyevskoy Highway. There were only 19 men left in the company, including 1 fighter from the artillery division, who had joined us on the way. Of the commanders, except for me, there was no one. The men looked at me the way I myself had looked at General Belov a few days before. I had to pull myself up and pretend that there was nothing to worry about. But everyone realized that danger might overtake us at any moment. Not reaching Bezlyudovka, we turned to the east. Large snow patches were still white on the fields. Toward dawn, we heard dogs barking and soon approached the village. After hesitating, we decided to go into one of the houses. Hunger is not a bad thing. Soon several women were cordially feeding us, lamenting. What is happening? The next night, having made a big detour, we approached Rogan. It seemed to me that the Kharkov-Volchansk highway was still defended by our troops. However, it was quiet here too. True, the silence turned out to be deceptive. As soon as we approached the last house, Hitlerites opened machine gun fire. Flares soared to the sky. And again we walked and walked. The topographical map ran out. We moved by compass. Shugaev forests were coming at us. Trees were cut down in some places. In some places we could see traces of battles, abandoned vehicles, weapons, helmets. At night the forest looked dense. The trees seemed to close together, and the distances seemed longer than in the daylight. There was not a soul around. After the rumble of street battles in Kharkov and the shelling near Rogani, we were deafened by the silence. Soon we began to come across groups of Soviet servicemen who were also leaving the encirclement. It became easier on the soul. At the end of the third day, we met a group of tankers headed by a major. I managed to look at the topographic map and take a scheme from it. Only on the fourth day our group got out to the Seversky Donets. On thin, broken ice, every minute risking to fall through, we crossed the river and came to our own. The 9-day way of the company to the Kursk Bulge turned out to be thorny. After leaving the encirclement, it was necessary first of all to find the battalion. The ubiquitous orderly and liaison sergeant as Rublenko, frowning impatiently, stepped from foot to foot. "Permit me. I already have the data for the Shukati." "Where did you get the data from?" The fighters were investigated. And indeed, a few hours later came on horseback Rublenko and Deputy Company Commander MEA Zharov, who had returned from the rear with replenishment for the battalion. "We already thought you were dead." And then Rublenko, like a snowball. In the area of Volchansk, our group joined the battalion. Masyakov looked at me and wiped his eyes. "You are alive, our academician, alive. I'm sorry, but I can only give you a night to rest. Take your men to the bath, and in the morning we'll go." Combat specified the task for the company and sighed. Volodka Nazarov. He was a soul of a man. "By the way, did you hear that Zaitsev was seriously wounded? And in the first company? To think of it, in Kharkov, out of 4 deputy politicians of the battalion and companies, 3 were lost. That's how it is." Petty officer of the company PP, K. Kamara, with military field officer MN Volodina, several wounded, and riders managed to leave even before Hitlerites cut the road to Volchansk. He searched for the battalion. With M.A. Zharov, who arrived from a business trip, they formed the core of the second company, went out of the encirclement, and joined the battalion a few more Red Army soldiers of our company, who closed the passages in the streets of Kharkov. Senior Sergeant A.M. Sherbak and Red Army man F.A. Puzanov, who got out of the encirclement after the single combat with tanks on Shatilovka, found the company. Combat allocated us replenishment 10 people. And from the new recruits mobilized in the villages nearest to Volchansk, we selected 15 more people, among whom there were experienced fighters, and young boys with no youth. Having washed and changed into new uniforms, issued out of time by Kizelev, my miners fell asleep in the sound sleep of people who had done their duty. Comrade Lieutenant. "Wake up. We must respect the parents of the mobilized and be at the send-off. Time is short, and they are waiting for us." Mikhail Andreevich Zharov pushed me vigorously. "We must respect the parents," P.K. Kamara echoed him. "Seeing my son off to the army, even in peacetime, it is a big event, and during the war even more so. We visited the house of each recruit, got acquainted with their families and parents. In several houses, mothers were the first to rush to meet us. So please look after ours. Make sure he writes. And as for his service, we told him to be good at everything." We manned 2 platoons on the move, and in Cherkaskoye, already on the arc, the 3rd platoon was formed again. Among the personnel of the company there were several namesakes. There were 3 Danilovs, 3 Sereda, 3 Uvarovs, 2 Novikovs, 2 Ivanovs. Getting acquainted with people, we tried to understand the peculiarities of each. Their own events inexorably drove us. Combat reported that after the capture of Kharkov, Hitlerites rushed from the south to Belgorod and set the task to cover with mines tank dangerous directions, which he marked on my map. At dawn it suddenly snowed. A belated blizzard was blowing. The battalion marched to Shibakino, Maslova Pristan, Solomino. Soon we began to overtake, pressing to the side of the road, 30 Chekars and artillery on the Mektyaga, and though the heavy vehicles sprinkled us with sticky spring mud, and sometimes made us slip into the ditch, we were glad to see them. It was the front reserves coming to block the enemy's way to Belgorod. Each of us understood perfectly well that our minds alone could only delay, but not stop the enemy. The situation was still changing rapidly and was not quite clear. March 19th, the company stopped for a break on a small farm near the forest. But in a few minutes, suddenly, without shooting, Hitler's tanks approached the farm. Only by the noise of the engines we learned about the approach of the enemy. Except for the miners, there were no other troops on the farm, and only the proximity of the forest allowed us to escape from Hitlerites. Having gone deeper into the forest along the only road, we stopped and took a breath. Lieutenant Zharov, who watched the enemy from the edge of the forest, reported, "Tigers are standing. They are waiting for something, and the tankers are already in the house." We had to fulfill the combat task in accordance with the situation, and the units started to mine the forest road. The newly received TMDB anti-tank wooden square mines, in which 4.8 kilograms of explosive briquettes and a TNT checker were laid, were known to be relatively simple and easy to handle. It was not by chance that the miners preferred them to the less perfect YAM-5. The new recruits, whose send-off we attended only the day before yesterday, had to be trained on the fly. This was done by the platoon commander N. I. Kasutin, a young lieutenant with a round smiling face, who arrived from the school. A mine detonator with an MV5 fuse needs special sensitivity. He instructed the recruits, "Even if a tank is crawling at you, you must remember this." The soldiers were convinced that the platoon commander was right in practice. Soon we heard the engines roaring, and the Tigers moved to the forest road, mined by us. There were 2 explosions. German tankers opened fire on the forest. Once again we had to move to the east in a situation unknown to us. At the railroad Volchansk-Belgorod, the company came across fascist tanks ahead of us. It was getting dark. We put the mines left on the wagons in the mud. Some German tank would surely bite. Having waited for darkness, we tried to cross the railroad bed, but Hitlerites noticed us and shelled us. We had to leave the wagons and go out light. Having jumped over the railroad, at dawn we unexpectedly came across Lieutenant M.E. Danilov, who with 3 men of our company also broke out of Kharkov occupied by the enemy, having bypassed Bolshaya Danilovka at night, which was in the hands of the fascists. How come? Danilov was not allowed into Danilovka, joked Zharov, hugging our platoon commander. Many soldiers of the company, whom we already considered missing in Kharkov, caught up with us even when we reconnected with the battalion. This continued right up to the Ark. All of them spared no effort to find their unit. In war, one's company is like a home. How can one not find it? Said the miners with a happy smile. 500-kilometer arc curved the front line around Kursk. This arc very much resembled in form a fist, put forward and as if threatening Hitlerites. Troops and armament were concentrated in the fist. Every day it became more and more formidable. After desperate, but unsuccessful attempts to get through to Aboyan and Volchansk from the area of newly captured Belgorod, Hitlerites were forced to go to defense. The 6th and 7th Guards armies together with the 40th Army of the Voronezh Front formed the southern facet of the Kursk Arc. In the defense strip of the 6th Guards Army of Lieutenant General I. M. Chistyakov units of our engineering brigade were concentrated. Already on March 25th, our battalion arrived on the southern front of the Arc and came under the operational subordination of the commander of the 22nd Guards Rifle Corps. The next day Mysyakov called me to him. "How lucky you are." "In what?" "In what you say?" "Everything. I'm alive, thank God. And I've got orders. Medal of Honor." "And for what?" I was sincerely surprised. For the fact that Tigers on Sumy did not let them. But they still passed. They did. Only after 2 days. "So you owe me." "That's right. In the meantime, let's go to the Corps engineer. We'll get a task. We'll meet in Cherkaskoye, at the church." The commander and I crossed several deep ravines. Infantrymen and artillerymen were fiddling in them, organizing their firing positions. Cherkasskoye village stretched along the ravines. Small houses were white in the sun. And in the center of the oblong hillock, squeezed by ravines, lonely stood a wooden beautiful church with a slender bell tower, mangled by shells. Corps Engineer Lieutenant Colonel N.E. Savrasov was already waiting for us, leaning against the stone plinth of the church and looking at his watch. Savrasov could have been at least 50. Grey hair was probably to blame for this. He was a tall, lean man in a carefully tucked-in uniform and boots polished to a shine. We reported our arrival. An engineer always needs accuracy, delicately hinted Lieutenant Colonel on our lateness. Now hello, and straight to business. But let's get out of here. Now the Hitlerites must hit the church. As soon as we went down to the shooting cell, dug in the ground, as on the hillock, where the church stood, there was a strong fire attack. Punctual enemy, nothing to say. Every day at the same time. Experienced warriors, but do not realize that such pedantry does not have a great effect. Having corrected his cap, Lieutenant Colonel Savrasov in a low, hoarse voice introduced us to the course of events. We heard that Hitlerites are intensively mined the front line north of Tomarivka. At the same time, they are continuously conducting active reconnaissance. That's why miners should keep their ears open. After listening to my report on the state of the company, Korinj pointed to several houses located in a deep ravine, south of the church. There I was to station my personnel. I ask you to complete the company as soon as possible. Savrasov turned to Mysyakov. Since it was badly hit, we will not put it on the mines right away. We'll let them get used to the situation. We should dismantle the church. It's been used as a landmark for a long time. Besides, it's been hit hard by shells. We'll build 12 machine gun bunkers out of planks. I'll show you the places. We had to suffer a lot when dismantling this dilapidated church. Dry planks on wooden nails were as if soldered into a monolithic construction. They knew how to build in Russia, especially when they did it for God. These masters would now be put on the bunkers, joked the tired soldiers. When the wood and earth firing points were ready, Lieutenant Colonel Savrasov arrived. Let's see. Well, miners, but in the poor cut down as skilled carpenters. The inspection of the bunkers took place by the light of a pocket flashlight. From one of the beams the living eyes of some saint looked at us softly. Bah, Christ descended here. It is masterfully painted. Maybe Rublev himself or his pupils had a hand in it. The Corps engineer coughed and half-jokingly, half-seriously remarked that such a sacrilege, however unwitting, could not be avoided. Savrasov's words turned out to be prophetic. In 13 weeks the enemy struck the strongest blow in this area. All April, and May they were nightly laying mines. In the strip of 67th and 52nd Guards divisions our company set about 5,000 mines. North of Tomarovka was studied every fold of terrain, every bush at the front edge of the defence. Will you forget with what tension of nerves was always connected with staying between our own and enemy positions? Will you forget how sometimes their own infantrymen in the trench, noticing our miners crawling from the enemy side, opened fire? Not everyone's nerves held out, and everyone experienced the meeting with danger in his own way. Our emotional memory preserves the feelings of a man leaving the location of his troops and heading on a mission towards the enemy. But recounting it is not so easy. In each case, the excitement of my comrades manifested itself differently. Some of them seemed outwardly completely calm, others could not hide the tension that engulfed them, and others could only show a slight trembling of their hands. Comrade Lieutenant, in case of anything, write home. Some soldiers would ask before going into the neutral zone. And this request always seemed to me quite natural, because if a man is sure that after his death his relatives will know how he fulfilled his duty, it is easier for him to face and overcome mortal danger. Regardless of individual perception of danger, the personnel of the company always fulfilled their duty. Volodya Nazarov was right, who believed that courage consists precisely in overcoming the sense of fear, in the fulfillment of their duty at any cost. Of danger. Our miners saw such a military officer Volodina on the Don, in Kharkov, at the Kursk Bulge. I always remembered the parting of Masha and Zhigalov near Oboyan, when our 210th Biz was disbanded. They looked at each other point blank for a long time. And then, for the first time, tears appeared in the girl's eyes. Oh, Masha, how she knows how to hold on. After all, I know that she has a storm in her soul, turning away his face, Zhigalov told me, when the car with Volodina and a few soldiers disappeared in the road dust. Masha long corresponded with Zhigalov, and it seemed to all of us that they would definitely be together, but Dima Zhigalov died. We buried him near the school in the village of Lesnevo, on a high bank, from which we could see the winding mirror of the southern bug. Masyakov and I did not dare to inform Masha Volodina about it for a long time. Now I even find it difficult to say whether we wrote at all. Perhaps proud Masha still thinks that Dima is alive. However, the fate of Volodina herself has been unknown to me ever since. In June 1943, I was appointed Chief of Staff of the battalion. And about a week later came the order to urgently install an additional number of minefields. It was the period immediately preceding the enemy offensive at the Kursk Bulge. Intelligence had already revealed the areas of accumulation of Hitler's troops. In this regard, the 2nd Mine Engineering Company was to increase the density of mines on the likely direction of the German strike. M.A. Zharov, to whom I surrendered the company, seriously ill to replace him, was no one. Combat had no choice but to allow me to return to my unit for the period of mines. Conditions for the installation of mines were particularly difficult because of the intensification of mutual actions of reconnaissance units and a large saturation of mines explosive barriers between the front lines of defense of the opposing armies. And yet we fulfilled the command's task in time. 1,500 mines were set by the company for 9-10 nights. And only the wounding of 3 soldiers by shrapnel of their own mine bombs too darkened our mood. For the first time in 10 days I washed and slept, and the same day was summoned to the headquarters of the rifle unit. Show me what anti-personnel minefields set your company in the area of Butovo, told me. I quickly showed everything on the map. Do you know that yesterday our scouts returning from a search exploded on this minefield? I honestly said that I did not know about it, that the minefield was given under guard to the commander of the rifle battalion. That on the form has his signature. It's good that there are no dead, I heard. It is possible, of course, that the scouts in the darkness simply lost their way and therefore did not get into the passage from which they came to search. But still we have to report to the command. The investigation began. There were calls, written and oral explanations. Those were the most unpleasant days for me at Kursk. But soon the big events overshadowed my small troubles. The situation was becoming more and more tense. We were expecting an enemy offensive from one day to the next. The troops took up positions, camouflage strike groups and reserves. According to the plan of operational camouflage, was equipped with many false positions of artillery, accumulations of tanks and infantry. Played possible variants of counterattacks and strikes on the expected enemy. Everyone studied his maneuver. And yet I was able to fully imagine the enormous amount of engineering work being done only when I got on horseback from the front line to the headquarters of our brigade, located deep in the defense in Greznoe. Commanders of all branches of the army carefully carried out engineering equipment and camouflage of their defense areas. Corps Engineer N. Savrasov, who put on the new colonel's epaulettes in June, with his usual politeness and delicacy criticized the negligent commander of the rifle battalion. Is this how machine gun emplacements are equipped? Look at the drawing. Where's your berm? I'm ashamed. So I'm not an engineer, Comrade Guards Colonel, the captain tried to justify himself. All the more reason for you to understand it. Even Peter the Great said it is very necessary for officers to know engineering. If anyone will not know, he will not be produced higher from the rank in which he finds himself. Fire positions, trenches, wire and mine explosive barriers woven into a unified system of defense. The main defense strip was up to 6 kilometers deep. It was followed by the 2nd and Army defense strip, but only after it was learned that in the back of their heads were prepared 2 frontal defensive lines enveloping Kursk from all sides. And further east of Kursk were the 3rd Front, and along the Don the state defence lines. The Kursk Bulge was, in fact, all dug trenches and filled with mine blast barriers. It was a giant fortress. Maybe that's why Hitler's command called its Operation Citadel. Hitler's order, which he signed on April 15, 1943, said, "I have decided, as soon as weather conditions permit, to carry out the first offensive of the year, Citadel. Victory at Kursk should be a torch for the whole world." We understood the enormity of the offensive being prepared and were determined to win the battle. Therefore, combat training of troops and development of engineering equipment of defence continued until the beginning of the enemy offensive. Did not stop working, and our battalion. In the early days of July, the companies of the battalion still continued to mine, but now already in the depth of the defence. They installed OSM 152 fragmentation mines using artillery shells of 152 mm caliber, exploded electrically, or by radio, as well as German captured shells, adapted as tension mines. In those days we had a very unusual incident. Served then in the battalion one of the Don old men Efreator A, Blokhin. Because of his grey hair he looked older than his 50 years, and was distinguished by the fact that he did everything very diligently, but not in a hurry. A man reliable in any case, the lieutenant sometimes caused censure from commanders for some slowness. Blokhin and his squad were just setting mines near the road, north of Yakovlevo, when a German airplane appeared above the soldiers, and a white cloud of leaflets separated from the airplane and began to disintegrate into separate sheets, smoothly falling to the ground near the minefield. Oh, a miracle, and only a miracle. Summer is in full swing, and it looks as if it's snowing. Blokhin remarked to no one in particular, and when the airplane with crosses passed very low, he raised his carbine and shot. Maybe I'll hit. What the hell is going on, he thought, and went back to work. And such a thing had to happen. German aircraft, shrouded in smoke, began to lose altitude, and then, stretching a few kilometers, crashed into the ground just at the positions of anti-aircraft battery, near the village of Krasnaya Polyana. Anti-aircraft gunners did not have time to fire and willingly signed the commander of the Engineering and Mine Company Act on the downed aircraft. And 3 days later the dazed Sergeant Blokhin was awarded the Order of the Patriotic War of the Second Degree. Summer was really in full swing. There came sultry days. The air became hot. It was difficult to breathe. On July 4th, a defector sapper who had surrendered as a prisoner near Belgorod, in the strip of the 6th Guards Army, Gustav Brunner, reported about the German offensive scheduled for July 5th. Private Formello of the Engineer Battalion of the 6th Infantry Division, taken prisoner on the northern phase of the Arc in the strip of the 15th Infantry Division of the 13th Army of the Central Front, confirmed these data. There were also other prisoners and defectors whose testimony matched. It is no coincidence that it was the sappers, who performed the tasks of making passages in there and our minefields, were the first to report the timing of the offensive. The offensive was not a surprise. Our command knew not only of the enemy's impending strikes, but even of their probable directions from the south and north. Nowhere else Soviet soldiers and officers were so well informed about possible actions of Hitlerites as here on the Kursk Bulge. I remember, in the headquarters of the battalion, which just before the beginning of the enemy offensive was pulled away from the front line and was located in the small village of Krasnaya Polyana, a dispute broke out. Some thought that the Nazis were deliberately engaged in disinformation to mislead us. Others said that perhaps the Germans did not know that the plan for their operation had already been revealed. Still others argued that the German command is not accustomed to change their plans, as well as the daily regime of artillery raids on our troops. The enemy is not stupider than we are. Heatedly Mysyakov, who had recently become a captain. Combat, back on the Don, considered a braggart commander and proudly repeated we fight as well as others, without any strategy began to change noticeably. He less and less often issued orders without consulting his subordinates and less persistent, defending their not always logical decisions. Now Mysyakov even took an interest in strategy. "What do you think, Chief of Staff?" asked Mysyakov, without the slightest irony about my academic baggage. At that time I also did not believe that the German fascist command would still carry out its own, already pre-disclosed plan of operation. But that was exactly what it was. In the afternoon of July 4th, when I was in the company, building up a mine strip south of Yakovivo, I heard a rumble stronger than usual. At first we did not pay much attention. We thought it was just another artillery duel on the front line, which was 6 to 8 kilometers ahead of us. It seemed to have begun, somewhere between Bitovo and Dragunsky. An artillery officer told me excitedly, "And there your brother has put such potatoes there, God willing." Familiar places. Together with the company I crawled there on my belly. But has it really begun? A few hours later, the wounded evacuated from the front line said that the enemy's advanced detachments managed to dislodge the 6th Guards Army units. By the evening of the same day, the enemy had pushed back the combat guard along the entire front west of the village of Draganskoy. At dawn on July 5th, a powerful artillery counterwork conducted by the 6th and 7th Guards armies rang out, and at 6 a.m. the battle for the main defence strip of our Voronezh front unfolded. It rumbled all round. The terrible rumble echoed even in the headphones of the radio. The weed-covered ground was ploughed over by shells. The bright blue sky was covered with the smoke of the explosions and the dust that rose from the disturbed earth. And overhead the rumble of aircraft engines was heard continuously. It was bombers of our 15th Air Army were coming to meet the planes of the 4th Hitlerite Air Fleet. From the hills near Yakovivo, where deep minefields were set up, we could clearly see not only air duels, but also continuous counterattacks of tanks and rifle units from detached positions and lines. The rumble of battle did not subside even at night. On July 6th, tanks of the SS divisions Adolf Hitler, Reich and Deadhead moved from the area of Bykovka to us on Yakovivo. Their rumbling was increasing with every minute. We were nervous while waiting for the order to put on alert the installed time mines northwest of Yakovivo on the highway Belgorod-Oboyan-Kursk. German tanks could approach in the next half an hour. Communication with the battalion was broken. We sent a third contact, but the commander did not appear. The artillery increased. Miners took cover in the ditch. Finally arrived Deputy Battalion Commander Senior Lieutenant D.S. Shigalov. Was the combat? Where is he? We ourselves are waiting. If they do not bring the order, I will act according to the situation. I'll go to the regiment's CP. I'll clarify, said Zigalov, and, dashingly jumping on the horse, drove it along the ravine, not paying attention to the bursting shells. In the narrow places of the highway, where it is difficult to bypass, we prepared in advance dead-end tunnels, and in them laid explosives. In places of possible detours, we equipped groups of anti-tank mines with fuses. In total, the battalion installed on the highway 37 time mines. As closures were used, then electrochemical and our 16-day mine fuses. 16 MZDs were laid by our second company. For each such mine was an average of 5 charges, that is 25 kilograms of explosives. The total weight of trinitrotoluene of each group of mines was 100 to 125 kilograms. The explosive force of such a charge is very significant. The most difficult and responsible task was to set the time of deceleration of the explosion. After all, if the combat situation changes and our troops will be on the highway during the expiration of the fuse, they will suffer losses from their own mines. Finally, we received an order defining the terms of deceleration in 6 to 8 days. We immediately inserted resistors into the electrochemical closers and set the alarm clocks to the appropriate divisions. We started the clock. The chemical reaction began. Time mines were put on alert. Not far from Yakovivo, there was an observation post of a company of the 211th Battalion of Special Mines, which was part of our brigade. The battalion was commanded by Captain Nikolai Komenko. From here, a wide field overgrown with weeds was perfectly visible. This field was a minefield. And here stood not ordinary mines, which our battalion mined, but special ones, controlled at a distance by radio. Under a thick layer of earth were laid 30 to 50 kilograms of explosives. Devices camouflaged near the mines received only one encrypted radio signal, which served as a command to trigger electric detonators and detonate a group of mines. While Zhigalov and I were gathering our men from the MZD facilities, large tanks were already crawling out of the ravines onto this peaceful-looking field. These were 60-ton Tigers with heavy puffers on the long barrels of 88mm guns. Here the tanks approached the invisible border of the minefield, shuddering from the impact of shells of our artillery on their 100mm frontal armor. The ominous rumble of the engines intensified. On the company radio was reported the situation 3-5s. This meant that German tanks were approaching the camouflaged mines. At the same moment, a powerful radio station, located in the depth of the defense, sent a conditional signal into the air. Several strong explosions lifted the unplowed land into the air. One Tiger went up in flames, another, as if a gust of wind, threw off its turret, and the third, having jerked several times, froze in place. In all, 7 tanks were destroyed. The rest stopped, and then crept into the ravine. Tanks with white crosses were also visible to the left. Into the rumble of battle came the sound of dogs barking furiously. Yes, dogs. They were rushing towards the tanks, as if competing in speed with armor-piercing shells flying over their heads. These were 4-legged helpers of miners of the 27th Battalion, commanded by Captain Shishov. Specially trained dogs with explosive bundles attached to their backs rushed under the bottom of tanks. The pins attached to the charge were bent, and the fuse, freed from the safety pin, was detonated. The charge of trinitrotoluene penetrated the bottom, which had the thinnest armor. The crew of the enemy tank was killed together with the dog that had blown it up. The effect of using specially trained dogs exceeded all expectations. The 27th Battalion released 17 trained dogs. 2 were killed on the way, and 15 reached the target. 11 enemy tanks were blown up by 4-legged friends of miners. We retreated to Krasnaya Polyana, to the battalion headquarters. Here was the assembly point of miners. By night came bloody and tired battalion's Partorg Lieutenant Emin Isharov. 5 miners arrived with him. Well, Mikhail Nikitich, revived Mysyakov. Who else was left? I left with the last of them. The passages were closed. It scratched a little. Where's Sergeyev? We haven't seen him. The Germans have been there for hours. God knows what happened to ours, but what Komenko's mines have done. The commander ordered the battalion to act as part of a mobile detachment of barrages, according to the situation in the direction of Olkovatka, Greznoye. The gathered personnel was divided into 3 groups. The mines were loaded on vehicles. The next day more than 100 mines were placed under the nose of Hitler's tankers. According to the prisoner's confession, Hitlerites suffered great losses on mine blast barriers of Kursk Bulge. Mines, covered by the fire of artillery and tanks, contributed to the disruption of the pace of the offensive. They caused fear. German soldiers everywhere expected lurking death and were afraid to move forward without their sappers. In the defensive battle were used all the mine means. At the small station Prokhorovka tank corps of the SS tried to bypass Oboyan to Kursk, but on July 12th, as a result of a parrying blow of the 5th Guards tank army, was defeated. The armoured fascist sword, mangled and scarred by the fire of Soviet aviation, artillery and explosions of engineering mines, bent by counterattacks of infantry and tanks, was finally broken. And although Hitlerites, having penetrated from the south to about 35 kilometers, formed a bleeding wound in our defense, they could not connect with their Oral group, which managed to go deep into the location of our troops only by 10 to 12 kilometers. The fascists could not cut off the Kursk Bulge. Exsanguinated, they were forced to hastily move to the defense. But not only the enemy was exsanguinated. The 6th Guards and other Soviet armies also suffered serious losses. Our 210th Battalion, having withdrawn to the area south of Oboyan, carried out the order to disband. The personnel was transferred to complete the engineering units of rifle units and formations. We sadly said goodbye to Andrei Markovich Shedabak, Avram Sergeyevich Rublenko, Peter Kornievich Kamara. They left, and their further fate remained unknown to me. Having received the rank of senior lieutenant and appointment to the post of Assistant Chief of Intelligence, I was already a few days in the brigade headquarters, when one sunny morning I was sought out by Mysyakov. He arrived in the Oboyan area to report to Colonel Krasnov on assuming command of the 207th Separate Battalion of Engineer Barriers. "So you're coming to me?" asked the commander, looking point blank. "Or would you rather chill in the brigade?" He groped me for a long time with a prickly look, and then summarized, "However, your refusal I also understand. Working with Kombrig Vitaly Petrovich is very interesting. Not ahead the general staff. He will predict the situation as if he was brought maps from Hitler's headquarters and Stalin himself called. Was it for nothing that Colonel Krasnov was the head of the army's engineering forces? Colonel Vitaly Petrovich Krasnov really had a lot of experience and a fine operational sense, thanks to which quite accurately determine the course of the upcoming battles. About a year ago, he formed a brigade on the Don and quickly trained 6 battalions of miners. But the colonel had a stubborn character, was straightforward, and sometimes burrowing, did not hesitate to cut the truth mutka. These traits of character did not always allow him to properly build relationships with their superiors. Easily lifting his heavy body, the colonel welcomed us with Mysyakov cordially. "Come on in, be brave. You decided to go to the battalion, I will not hold you back. You need people there more," he said in my direction. "Please, brothers sappers." Krasnov offered us to sit down and after a pause said to Mysyakov, "Well, combat what you asked gave. Mines will be delivered. Now it's up to you, the debt is red with payment. The main thing for me is battalions. They fight, they forge victory for the motherland, they create glory for the brigade. The enemy's offensive has collapsed, but the losses he suffered are nothing compared to the fact that he lost confidence. And after all, the Kursk defense is classic, remember me. The commander looked at us carefully and continued, this defense will be studied by our children and grandchildren. And what about grandchildren? The Battle of Kursk will remain in history. And now it's time. Go out to the battalion, you are to fight, you are responsible for the men. There's a counter-offensive the other day. Apparently we'll take Kharkov. For good now. And we'll be in Poltava before the fall. I've got a daughter left there. The only one. She went to the south, stayed at her aunt's, and the war took her there. What's wrong with her? I can't find peace." Vitaly Petrovich fell silent. The brigade knew about the brigadier's grief. Many soldiers and officers were then in such a position. The feelings of the brigade commander were close and understandable to them. Looking ahead, I will say that after the liberation of Poltava, Colonel Krasnov did not find his daughter or her aunt. He experienced his grief so hard that he even went to the hospital. Soon after the war, Vitaly Petrovich died. What ruined him, grief or illness? Apparently both. Thanks to Mysyakov's efforts, Zhigalov, Cherkashin, myself and several other officers and sergeants from our disbanded 210th BIS were reunited again in the 207th Independent Battalion of Engineer Barriers, in connection with the merger of the posts of Deputy Battalion Commander and Chief of Staff DS Zhigalov was offered to take over the company, to which he immediately agreed. We barely had time to get acquainted with the personnel of the new For Us unit, as came an urgent package. The 207th OBIS was transferred to the operational subordination of the 23rd Guards Rifle Corps. Once again fierce fighting ensued, as a result of which the 6th Guards and other armies of the Voronezh and steppe fronts restored the position that our troops had occupied until July 5th. The main task of the battalion was demining. A lot of trouble gave us a lot of new German metal TMI-43, wooden anti-tank Holzminen, and old dangerous familiar anti-personnel Springminen. At first I wondered why the soldiers of the 2nd Engineer and Mine Company, which Zhigalov began to command, were so happy to see Holzminen in the area of Verkopenia, but soon figured out what was going on. The fighters were very sensitive to any little thing that could somehow predetermine the course of further events. Since Hitler switched to wooden mines, they told me, it means that there is not enough metal, and without metal you can't make war. At that time the epidemic of mine boosting broke out. It especially affected the zone left by our troops and newly liberated by July 23rd. In this zone, in addition to our preserved mine blast barriers, A large number of enemy mines were installed. Explosions began. Especially morally overwhelmed the troops' surprise mines, which we found in almost every liberated village. The surprises were mostly of a straining action. Usually it looked like this. There was, let's say, a German machine gun, a fountain pen or some other bait. It is connected by a thin cable to the fuse pin inserted in the explosive charge. As soon as someone tries to pick up such a find, there is an explosion. All surprises were, as a rule, well camouflaged, and only an experienced eye of a mineral could detect them, and even then not always. Here's the surprise I took off, reported Sergeant A.G. Risis, whispering terribly. An old accordion was booby-trapped. And the experienced miner showed us how the explosive charge was fixed inside the mech, and a wire went from the fuse to the half-hull with the left keyboard. The explosion was supposed to occur when playing the accordion. And in the area of Alexievka, our fighters had to make a lot of trouble with cowsheds skillfully mined by Hitlerites. On the bank of the leisurely river Pina, there was a cattle yard, formerly belonging to the local collective farm. Having diffused the charge of tension action, buried in the ground, which should have been triggered when the gate was opened, the Department of Junior Sergeant I.P. Frolov got into the territory of the cattle barn. The cowshed was almost empty. When one of the cows was approached by a lean, slightly stooped miner Lagutin, the animal turned its head to him. At the same moment, the miner noticed a thin cable connecting the collar to the feed trough. Instantly realizing what was going on, Lagutin cut the wire with wire cutters. Miner was not mistaken, in the feeder was a charge of explosives. We almost went to the grave with this cow, sighed Lagutin, examining the rescued animal. "And how long will you admire your goddaughter?" Frolov asked. "It's time to pack." "I'm worried, Comrade Junior Sergeant. What if she still has explosives on her?" "You'd better look under the tail," the squad commander advised nonchalantly. We laughed heartily when we learned about the conversation between Lagutin and Frolov, but actually it was not to laugh. Insidious surprises, set by Hitler's miners, posed a great danger. Cases of detonation on surprises so aggravated mine fear that soldiers and officers preferred not to touch the most harmless objects without the help of a long rope and a hook. The minesmen were looked upon with special respect, as doctors who alone could prevent mortal danger. The command urgently issued orders forbidding to settle in populated areas and obliging to conduct a thorough check of the terrain for mines. The political organs of the front and headquarters of the engineering troops issued special leaflets explaining how to disarm surprises. Great explanatory work was carried out by the headquarters of the Chief of Engineers of the 6th Guards Army, General E.I. Kulinik, and the Chief of Staff, grey-haired Colonel Koltin, and the officers of this headquarters worked hard to issue special information sheets and instructions on the fight against mines. The personnel of the battalion was suffocating from the incessant incoming assignments. Mines had to be removed not only during the day, but also at night. The troops could not wait. About 35,000 mines and several hundred surprises removed and neutralized our battalion in that period. And wherever there were inscriptions or pointers demined, "Check no mines," the way for the troops was free. Soon it was possible to completely eliminate the dangerous epidemic of mines. After the failure of the Operation Citadel created favorable conditions for a counter-offensive and the liberation of Belgorod and Kharkov in the south and Ural in the north. The attack on Belgorod began on August 3rd unexpectedly for the enemy. The city was liberated already on August 5th, and our battalion, ensuring the advance of the fighting order of the troops of the 23rd Guards Rifle Corps west of Belgorod, made passages in the barriers, clearing the way to Tomarivka, Zolochev and Bogodukov. But the offensive in the Poltava direction was stopped by blows of SS divisions Great Germany, Deadhead, Viking and Reich. The front lines stretched, bizarrely curved under the counterattack of troops, from Aktyrka to Kharkov. The August sun baked mercilessly. Above us hovered a German Scout, a two-fuselage Focke-Wulf. Annoyingly buzzing, the airplane was trotting along the Bogodukov-Krasnokutsk road, photographing positions near the Merla River, a tributary of the Vorskla. The poorly paved road was deserted. People hid either from the heat or from the circling overhead frame with armoured cockpit of the pilot, and only from the hills that rose steeply along the road to the reconnaissance plane's stretched tracer machine gun bursts. A powerful artillery raid broke the silence. Private P. Provorov jumped out on the road, where we and the company commander, Senior Lieutenant Enenianov, were making out minefield forms. "Tanks, tanks went," he shouted to us. "Have you lost your safety pin? Run back to your platoon." Company commander Emelianov shouted to Provorov. Behind Merla, our battalion set up anti-tank minefields and prepared to blow up the bridge crossing over the swampy area with the old river. Nazi tanks attacked from the south. They wedged in at the junction of the 6th Guards and 1st Tank Army and almost jumped out through the passages in the minefields and across the bridge to the road Bogokov-Krasnokutsky. The company's minutemen guarding these passages saw the suddenly appeared 45-ton Panthers and the Ferdinand self-propelled vehicles following them. Jumping out of their hiding places, the squads of Sergeant Nikolai Largin and Junior Sergeant Ivan Scharf closed 2 passages with TMI mines, and the platoon commander, Lieutenant N. Borodkin, turning the key of the PM2 blasting machine, blew up the first bridge at the bridge crossing over the swampy floodplain of the Merla River. The miners went out through the reed-covered swamp, which hid them well from the SS tankers. When Emelianov and I crawled to the hillock, we saw 4 blown-up German vehicles. At that time, a division of the Fighter Anti-Tank Artillery Regiment came up. Artillerists Iptopovtsi opened fire. Panthers and Ferdinand began to retreat. The division shot tanks blown up on mines and hit a few more. Large tank counterattacks on the edge of the Voronezh front wedge in the areas of Aktyrka, Kolontayev, Krasnokutsky continued throughout August and thoroughly exhausted the personnel of the battalion. Only the company of Senior Lieutenant N.N. Emelianov 3 times built and 3 times blew up in front of enemy tanks several bridges across the Merla River south of Krasnokutsk, and some units had to even steeper. The specificity of the combat work of sappers was that they had to interact with all kinds of troops to make a crossing, to build a bridge, to make passages in the barriers, to cover the positions with mines. I must say that in the units with which we interacted, we were treated with warmth and care. People rejoiced when they were given engineering units, which had enough to take care of in any situation. In early September, local fighting broke out for Slobodka, located among the trees behind the Merla River. SS from the division Dead Head suddenly captured this small village, from which they began methodical shelling of the command post of the 23rd Guards Rifle Corps, the road to Krasnokutsk and our artillery positions. It took several days to drive the fascists out of Slobodka. From the north and west it was covered by a swampy floodplain of the Merla River, and from the east a spacious glade, which was shot by the enemy in all directions. This place was not in vain nicknamed the Glade of Death. Our battalion was ordered to pass through the minefields in front of Slobodka Tank Regiment. On the night of September 5th, Captain M. Krichevsky's company secretly made and marked 4 passes under the nose of the Nazis. But the tank regiment came under the strongest fire of the enemy and withdrew. Our tractors had to tow 2 tanks that were hit. The next day, the Corps Commander Major General N.T. Tavatkiladze called Mysyakov. Why did not fulfill the task? Tankers reported that there were no passages in the minefields. The sappers thwarted the attack. People are dying for nothing. I'll put them on trial. Check and report. Mysyakov returned from Comcorps' office gloomy and angry. We must urgently check the passages. That's all he said. As soon as the evening dusk thickened, me and Battalion Sergeant A. Gurevich and a tank engineer. Gurevich and an engineer of the tank regiment had to overcome the Glade of Death. The sergeant was a civil engineer. Perfectly oriented in the darkness, he crawled ahead of us, pointing the way. When Hitlerites launched rockets, or a powerful beam of searchlight began to glide across the glade, everyone froze, huddling against the corpses that had not been cleaned up. Having made sure that the passages were made and marked with one-sided signs, white triangles, and that therefore the tankers had accused the miners in vain, we crawled to the battalion location, still covering ourselves with the dead. And those who were still recently fighters once again shielded us from the enemy. The Soviet troops turned the page of history. The Battle of Kursk was behind us. And although everyone at that time was already thinking about the Dnieper, the desire to summarize the accumulated experience mentally brought us back to the past. For miners, for example, the Battle of Kursk was a real academy. Here we got acquainted with all kinds of mine explosive means, starting with various anti-tank mines of pressure action and ending with mines controlled by radio and carried in satchels by dogs. Here the main spheres of miners' activity were revealed to the end: mining and demining. The head of the engineering troops of the front, General E.V. Bordzilovsky, told us when we met. Attacking. The enemy has the right to determine the time, place and forces to strike. It would seem that he has full initiative. However, it is not quite so. Apart from you and me, the terrain with its engineering equipment and mine blast barriers stands in his way. During the period of fighting at the Kursk Bulge, according to General Bordzilovsky's calculations, the engineering troops of the Voronezh front blew up about 600 enemy tanks. I know there will be skeptics who will say with a smile that the number of German tanks damaged and destroyed by Soviet pilots, artillerymen, tankers and sappers on the southern phase of the arc exceeds the total number of tanks the enemy had in that section. That may be true, I would reply to the skeptics. But such arithmetic cannot be used in this case. The account here is special. I will try to support my thought with the considerations of our front and some officers of the brigade. First of all, there is often a double counting. Miners, let's say, blew up a tank, and artillerymen shot it on a minefield, as it happened in the combat practice of our battalion near the Merla River, and in some other cases. After all, if you do not destroy the tank, the technical service of the enemy will evacuate and restore it. So the tanks must be achieved, so that they do not return to service a second time. And therefore both miners and artillerymen have the right to consider such tanks for themselves, because both fulfill their tasks. Secondly, everything was in the dynamics. Instead of destroyed tanks, the enemy continuously received new ones. In addition, some of the machines were restored in the field. Consequently, the number of engaged, including repeatedly, the enemy tanks was much higher. The effectiveness of mine barriers was also manifested in the fact that the pace of the enemy's advance was interrupted, and this was of paramount importance in the war. As for the fight with mine barriers of large densities which were on the Kursk Bulge, we experienced all its charms, on our own skin during the counter-offensive. So when the enemy was thrown back, we clarified the effect of triggered time mines. Of the 37 MZD installed by our battalion along the highway Belgorod-Boyan, 32 worked. Just like the radio-detonated Ozum 152, located at the positions occupied by the enemy in the offensive, the time mines caused a strong psychological effect. They began to explode after 6 to 8 days in the rear of the enemy troops who had penetrated into our defense and caused great damage to equipment and manpower. German engineers, for example, were afraid to restore one of the bridges in the embankment to which the MZD was blown up. They had to make a detour to the side and build a new bridge, which took much longer. Returning again to the southern facet of the arc, we were able to clarify the losses the enemy had suffered at the battalion's obstacles. In the combat log of the 207th Separate Battalion of Engineer Barrages, it is written: during the fighting at the Kursk Bulge on minefields and landfills set by the battalion, 41 enemy tanks were destroyed or hit. To this should be added dozens of vehicles and hundreds of Hitlerites. And this is the result of combat work of only one battalion,